get started. Unlike in being a physical room, no one can sort of chat to each other while we wait. So it's always a bit of a thing, isn't it? Right, yeah, okay, we will begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first event of this year with the Young Fabians Environment Network. My name is George Richmond. I'm the A Policy Officer of the network, and I will be chairing tonight's procedures. We, of course, are discussing rebuilding our green and pleasant lands. It's often said that our lands are not so green and pleasant at the moment and in its current stage, particularly in the face of the climate and ecological crisis. And we're going to be discussing how Labour can possibly solve or put forward an agenda to solve some of those or the entirety of the land and biodiversity crisis. And we are, of course, joined by a brilliant panel consisting of Nick Hayes, Guy Shrubsole, Chris Smaje, and Kerry McCarthy. Apologies if I've done a terrible pronunciation of names. I am always bad at that, despite having done podcasts for many years. And I will hand over very shortly to them to introduce themselves, and then they will discuss, of course, some of their ideas. But before we do that, I just want to sort of do some housekeeping and also structures as well. We are recording this, so if you don't want to be recorded or you want to keep anonymous, please feel free to turn your camera off and change your name. Also, another thing is to just sort of lay out the structure of tonight. So we'll have introductions. The speakers will introduce themselves, then do a sort of 5 minute, up to 5 minutes, sort of spiel on what their views, their main points on the land and biodiversity crisis is and what we're facing. And then we'll move straight to a discussion. And I will ask a few questions to the panelists, and then we will then move to open it up to the floor. If you do have any questions and you don't want to speak personally or on camera, then feel free to message me personally on the Zoom chat, and I'd be happy to ask the questions to the panelists on your behalf and keep you anonymous if you'd like that. But without further ado, let's sort of get started. And if I can ask Kerry McCarthy MP to introduce herself and perhaps give us a few pointers on what are the main sort of contentions within the biodiversity and land crisis that we face in this country. What would be her main vision for changing that? Kerry, over to you.
Okay, thank you, George. And for those who don't know, I'm Kerry McCarthy. I've been the Labour MP for Bristol East since 2005. And at the moment, I'm a Shadow Minister in the transport team, and I cover decarbonisation of transport and active travel and various things that aren't relevant to or aren't particularly relevant to today's discussion. But I have in the past, I did a short spell as Shadow Secretary of State at DEFRA, but perhaps more importantly, because it went on for longer, I was on the EFRA Select Committee and also the Environmental Audit Committee, where we touched on quite a lot of these issues. I also chair the All-Party Group on Agroecology for Sustainable Food and Farming, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's how we can move towards more nature-friendly farming, and that very much is about land use. I hesitate to give any statistics at all because I know that Guy is speaking in a moment, and Guy is the absolute guru when it comes to statistics about land use. So I'll try and avoid the numbers, but I think my basic argument was that far too much land in this country is given up to unproductive agriculture or agriculture of a type that it does not benefit our natural environment. We ought to be looking far more. If you look at the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations on this, we should be looking far more at nature-based solutions to climate change. So that's partly, there's a lot of focus on planting more trees. There's a bit of a government obsession. I don't know if you remember at the 2019 election, there was almost a bit of a bun fight with one party saying they'd plant 20 million and the next one going 40, and everyone trying to outbid each other. Planting trees is really important, although it's also important they're in the right places for things like flood mitigation and they're the right type of tree. But one of the things we overlook is peatlands, and I see we've got Adam on the call who's very much involved in this at the RSPB. Our peatlands are incredibly powerful carbon sinks, in terms of carbon sequestration. They're incredibly good at removing carbon from the atmosphere. If you burn peatlands, which is what's happening on our grouse moors to facilitate intensive grouse shooting, you're releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. So it's a negative impact. So and there's a lot more, sort of going slightly outside the land side, in terms of things like seagrass and as well that we could use on nature-based solutions. In terms of farming, I think we need to move away from that intensive industrialised form, and the agriculture bill, which has been going through Parliament for the last few years and it's just coming in, it's actually a good bill in that it shifts away from the common agricultural policy approach of rewarding farmers for how much land they own to rewarding them for what they do with the land. And it's not about food production, it's about things like enhancing biodiversity on their land, reducing the carbon footprint, some of the nature-based solution stuff, better soil quality, because again, soil can be really good in terms of carbon sequestration, and obviously, being promoting biodiversity and soil fertility helps us grow more and so on. So I'm slightly worried, I'm very worried in that Michael Gove was the driving force behind this. I think he genuinely got that agenda, which we supported as the all-party group. I don't think George Eustace does. I think he's he's from a very traditional farming background, fruit farmer, that's his family business. And I'm seeing slightly worrying signs that he's trying to row back on the ambition of that agenda. We've also got the Environment Bill going through Parliament at the moment, very, very slowly making its way through. It'll be brought back after the Queen's speech, and we don't think it'll become law till September. There's some good stuff in there that touches on land use. So, for example, the concept of net gain, in that if there is development, if you build over the land, you ought to ensure that there's a net environmental benefit overall by offsetting that with planting trees or doing other things. I'm sceptical about how that works in practice, as to how you monitor it going into the long term, and who's responsible, who gets sued if they don't recreate the, for HS2, for example, with the woodlands that are being destroyed. Who's going to judge 20 years down the line whether you've managed to recreate that somewhere? But the bill is a sort of powerful tool in some respects, and we've just got to try and make it, and the Office of Environmental Protection that is created by that bill, as powerful as possible. The final thing, one of the amendments that I was trying to get through in the Environment Bill was about our links to deforestation in other countries. And I think it's really important that we, I think one of the whole big topics we ought to be addressing at COP26 is how our carbon footprint shouldn't just be measured on what we produce at home, it should be measured on consumption. And so much of our consumption of food and other commodities is linked to deforestation in the Amazon. So whether that's the cattle farm in there, it's the soya production, the livestock feed. So for example, chickens that you may think that, there's a lot of talk about beef and the carbon impact of that sort of livestock farming, but actually if you're feeding chickens on soya that's imported, or your grains that's imported from the Amazon, you may well be contributing to deforestation there. And although the government gives funding by way of grants to try to, you'll see figures being put out by the government about how much, how they're putting money into reforestation projects in Brazil. It's tiny compared to the extent to which Bolsonaro is actually allowing the land to be raised and turned into productive land. And there's a lot of British companies that are involved in it through financing that or directly through importing the goods. So we're trying to get an amendment in, and I'd be really happy if people supported that when the bill comes back. I think it's coming back in May after the Queen's speech. I could say a lot more about things like the regenerative agriculture, rewilding, people like George Monbiot have been talking about for a long time. I think there's real questions about whether some of the land we use would be, there's a bit of an assumption, or a perception that the traditional British countryside is cows grazing in fields, and the sort of hills that you see, the sort of denuded countryside with no trees and not much by way of growth, is what the countryside looks like. And actually, there's question mark about whether we could be doing far more to promote biodiversity and a healthy countryside if less land was given over to grazing. And one of the other Committee on Climate Change recommendations was about people reducing their meat and dairy consumption, which I could talk about forever, but yeah, that's clearly something that I support, and I think that we do have to grapple with at some point. And if we do that, then that would mean quite a substantial change to land use in this country.
Thank you so much for that, Kerry. And I now go straight to Nick.
Hello, everyone. My name's Nick Hayes. I'm the author of a book called The Book of Trespass, which is basically an account of me jumping over the walls and barbed wire of like some of the grandest estates in our country, basically looking into the history of how the commoner was divorced from the commons, how we, the public, lost our rights to access land. I'm also part of a sort of co-founder of a campaign with Guy Shrubsole that's lined up to speak on this call too. And it's the Right to Roam campaign. And it's a campaign that we've launched essentially with the premise that for too long, the public have been divorced from the nature that we once used to have rights to. We argue that as it stands, the climate debate, the extinction, the issues of our countryside are in many ways just an abstract concept, because so few of us have a sort of regular engagement and connection to the nature that we're actually told we all need to save. There's a scientist called Michael Pyle that wrote that, you know, what is the extinction of a condor to a child that's never known a wren? And it's a very real thing. Like, we are forbidden, actively forbidden from 92% of our land and 97% of our rivers. If we're on a river, you know, there's a 97% chance that we're trespassing. Our campaign has obviously been stalled in some ways by lockdown, but also given a sort of unprecedented kind of boost in that people are walking their local rights of ways now. People are actually seeing them for themselves, the barbed wire and the fences that actually block us from an enormous amount of other countryside, of other places that we could be exploring and gaining the natural health benefits from. So we're kind of inspired, you know, it's Boris that's been making the link between the war, but between the pandemic and the war, but the Attlee government at the end of the war, as part of the suite that was offered to the public as part of the welfare state, alongside the NHS, Right to Roam was actually considered as a kind of sister to the NHS. It was sort of widely recognised that the Natural Health Service was something that, in terms of mental health and in terms of physical health, could actually, to use the words of the time, alleviate the pressure on the NHS. It could provide people the right to prevent ill health and disease before the need for the National Health Service to, you know, cradle us when we actually fall ill. Again, it was a Labour government that brought in the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which was the piece of legislation that actually opened up 8% of the countryside to a right to roam. But coming at it from a health perspective, which is the main concern of our campaign, the science has proven that we don't just need access to nature, we need a regular and constant immersion in it for it to have any kind of registrable effect on our mental and physical health. So essentially, in a nutshell, we're looking to bring the CROW Act, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, to people's doorsteps, where they can actually have the rights to immerse themselves in nature without kind of relegating it basically as a holiday destination for those that can afford it. We're looking to open up rivers to a right to roam. We're looking to open up woodlands, and we're looking to open up greenbelt, because these are the most accessible terrains. But we're also, we began the campaign aware of the issues of litter and vandalism and this kind of cliche, I would say, but like this sense that the public are in some way a kind of threat, or you know, or provide, you know, instances of vandalism to the countryside. we've realized during the campaign that actually it's that old commons paradigm that, you know, the commons weren't just areas of land that that we had rights to. You know, you could go and graze your pigs and keep your bees on these places. They were also a paradigm that measured rights with responsibilities. It gave local people the right to be involved with decision making over the land. It was a participatory and a kind of reciprocal relationship with nature. So we very much want to foreground that idea that only by engaging with nature are we going to be able to actually, on one hand, valorize the farmers that are like the nurses and doctors that have helped us through the pandemic, essential workers to the, you know, to the working of this nation, but also a sense of community. Like, these are places where people can actually come together outside of that kind of Facebook bubble or the tribalism, where people can exchange a few pleasant words. So without seeing access to nature as the kind of, you know, the panacea, the plaster that solves all of our ills, we definitely see it as a kind of bi-pronged benefit, that it's something that will improve the health of a nation, but also heal some of the divides and some of the rifts, you know, and that might be taking the metaphor too far, but if you really do remove the barriers that divide us from nature, you know, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that you remove the barriers that divide us from each other as well. So it's from that perspective that I'm here tonight, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nick. And we go straight to Chris.
Hi, thanks. Evening, everyone. My name's Chris Smaje. I am a small-scale farmer and grower based in Somerset. Just recently published a book called A Small Farm Future. I'm also one of the directors of the Ecological Land Co-op and a member of the Land Workers Alliance, which is affiliated internationally with La Via Campesina, but I'm just talking in a personal capacity tonight. I mean, I guess I'd put all this into a sort of bigger global and historical context. I mean, I sort of think we're facing a real perfect storm of global crises. There's climate and biodiversity, obviously, that we've been talking about, also energy futures, where I think it's unlikely that we're going to be able to continue using clean energy in the future at the levels that we've become accustomed to using fossil energy. Massive issues globally with water, particularly in agriculture, massive issues with soil, particularly phosphates, and whether we can keep using phosphates for agriculture in the way that we've become accustomed to. And also, of course, economic inequality and political instability. And I think all of this is going to lead to huge human migration, sort of both within and between countries, which is potentially going to be very conflict fueled. So sort of generally, I think that, you know, we're not really embracing the gravity of all these issues in our sort of mainstream political narratives. So trying to think of, you know, where do we go in sort of achievable policy terms? I mean, I don't think there are any sort of simple or single policy solutions. I'm not even sure we should be assuming that the sort of political world of sort of stable nation states that we've become accustomed to is going to be with us long term. But I think what we can do is use our present politics and our present resources to build more renewable societies, which I think is largely going to be agrarian rural societies furnishing primarily local needs. And I know that's kind of the exact opposite of, you know, the trends and the narratives that we tell ourselves about progress in recent history, but nevertheless, I kind of think that's inescapably where we're going. In terms of more sort of grounded specific policies, a few things. I mean, in terms of the title of this, the Green and Pleasant Land, I was walking last summer with a friend of mine from the city through this kind of psychedelically green, over nitrified monoculture of perennial ryegrass, and he said, "Oh, it's great to be in the unspoilt countryside, isn't it?" Whereas it kind of looked anything but unspoilt to me. You know, to my eyes, it would look much less spoilt if it had 3 or 4 small holdings with gardens, orchards, a little bit of pasture, maybe a few trees. So I think we need to have a much deeper national narrative about, what the countryside is like and what it's for, and kind of getting back to one of the original ideas of the Green Belt, which was not about excluding, keeping people out of the countryside, stopping them from living in the countryside, but about having agricultural space around towns and villages, small farms that were feeding our settlements. So we kind of need to get back to that sort of debate. So in terms of biodiversity, I guess I'm coming from a fairly land sharing perspective, but there's all sorts of different ways of slicing that up. So that means, I think, rethinking planning policy, or maybe not really rethinking the policy necessarily, but rethinking planning cultures, making it easier for people to live and work in the countryside on small farms that are primarily geared to serving local needs rather than kind of larger scale commodity farming, and kind of restoring a more nested settlement geography of village, farmland, villages, small market towns, and so on. Part of the problem, I mean, there's a whole other set of really knotty economic issues around relative prices. So the price of land, of farmland, but also the price of housing is incredibly high. The price of fossil energy is incredibly low, and food prices are also incredibly low. And that makes it really difficult to get new entrants. There's plenty of people who want to get into more nature friendly and more agroecological farming, but it's really difficult to get a foot in the door. And I won't go into the sort of all the policy wonkery of how we deal with these different land prices and relative prices, but I think that is a real problem in terms of getting more nature friendly agroecological farming. And I think we kind of have a little bit of a time window, an important time window at the moment, with Brexit, with the traditional farm workforces and aging workforce. And I think over the next few years, we're going to see quite a lot of land coming on the market and potentially changing hands. And it's a really key time, I think, when we can try and repurpose some of that land and in a sense sort of decommodify it from the sort of farming that we've become accustomed to towards these more localist purposes. And then a whole set of issues around horticulture. We import most of our fresh fruit and veg in the UK. I think we need to contest the sort of myth that it's either economically or ecologically a good idea to do that. We need to support gardening at all scales, from sort of domestic backyard gardening to commercial horticulture, and sort of that involves all sorts of mentoring and support, all sorts of things we can do to support gardening, but essentially to sort of reclaim horticulture nationally. And so those are a bunch of different policy areas. I guess George suggested maybe just one policy area. And I think, at the root of a lot of this is fossil fuels. I mean, certainly at the root of climate change and biodiversity problems, but, the availability of cheap and abundant energy has kind of scrambled and disassembled so much of, what is, a more agroecological and more localist ways of doing things. So in terms of a policy prescription, I think really high carbon taxes, or just very, we just need to stop using fossil fuels. That's a key way of kind of reassembling, more sensible land use and greater biodiversity. So yeah, I think that's me done. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And Guy.
Hi, everyone. My name's Guy. I'm wearing a few hats this evening. Firstly, as the author of this book, Who Owns England? Buy it from independent bookshops. Secondly, I helped co-author this report for the Labour Party a year or two ago now, Land for the Many. So we might talk a bit about that maybe. But also, I've been excited to join Rewilding Britain recently, which is obviously trying to promote rewilding across the whole of Britain, as the name suggests. But I wanted to talk about a few things. So things that are really barriers to us being more ambitious with regard to biodiversity and land. I mean, firstly, I think the biodiversity crisis itself gets far less attention still than the climate crisis. You only have to look at how much interest and excitement there is about, the UK hosting COP26 at the end of this year, which is important. But hardly anyone is talking about the Biodiversity Summit in Kunming in China later this year, which is equally, if not more important, and probably more will get decided at it, to be honest, that's of relevance to the world. There's not actually a huge amount actually up for discussion in the negotiations at COP26, as important as it is still. We, with a few exceptions, such as Kerry, of course, very few MPs are sort of talking about biodiversity and the extinction crisis, and nearly as much as we need to be. And we saw what huge impact the Stern Review got when it first came out onto the economics of climate change. And that was over 15 years ago now, and it's still having repercussions. The amount of press coverage that the more recent Dasgupta review got on the economics of biodiversity is an absolute fraction of the amount that Stern got. And so I think we really need to start to really think about how we build a movement around nature and restoring nature and rewilding, as well as all the work that's been done to get climate change onto the geopolitical agenda as it has done. We obviously have a number of opportunities to do that this year. One of those is the Environment Bill that Kerry has already referred to. When it does return, there's in addition to Kerry's excellent amendments, I think there is one thing that is very important we also all get behind, which is this big cross-sector campaign, which is being spearheaded by Wildlife and Countryside Link, and it's basically to put a 2030 state of nature target into law. That is essentially saying we need to turn this thing around by 2030. We need to have made sure that nature is no longer declining in this country as it has done for decades, but is actually on the road to recovery again, and we've actually turned a corner. And I mean, we're asking no less of, our government is asking no less of world leaders. So why on earth can't it do so itself and put that into law? And so that's something that I'll post a link round to the petition for that into the chat box in a bit, because I'm a big believer in having debates, but also ensuring that we know what we're doing next out of things. So I'll post that in there. But the other thing the only thing that is on world leaders' radars when it comes to nature this year seems to be this pledge, which is a great pledge, which is around 30. It's called the 30 by 30 pledge, and it's essentially to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. So it's catchy. Boris Johnson has signed up to it. He's said he's going to protect 30% of the UK's land and sea, and specifically England's, because that's what he's got jurisdiction over. But he's already decided to count national parks and other designated sites towards that, and his claim that they count for 26% of that target. And I live in Devon. I live near Dartmoor. Wonderful place, absolutely fantastic national park, as many of them are. But when I walk onto it, into the middle of it, there is not a lot going on there in terms of biodiversity, far, far less than there should be. I love going to some of the remnants of temperate rainforest that cling on to the edge of Dartmoor. They're absolutely amazing. They're much wilder, have a lot more species and biodiversity going on in them. But there is a huge amount more that could be being done in our national parks and needs to be done in our national parks in order to make sure that they count towards this 30 by 30 pledge. And obviously we need to be doing this across the whole countryside as well, the whole of the landscape. But I think in particular, we do need to be helping to better protect and to recover and rewild large reserves of land where nature can really recover properly, and then can sort of migrate out into the wider countryside via these sort of nature recovery networks, via hedgerows, via connectivity between nature reserves and these bigger habitats. And fortunately also, the government is well overdue a response to a review it commissioned a couple of years ago into the state of our national parks. It was called the Glover Review, and the government still haven't responded to it, and they are probably going to do so this year, not least because this year is the 70th anniversary of the first national park being designated. The Peak District was the first one, followed swiftly by the Devon and by Dartmoor and Lake District in Snowdonia. And when the government does respond, what we really need them to do is to ensure that national parks are delivering much more for nature. And one way in which we think we could do that is by picking up one of the things that Julian Glover talked about in his review, and that's to have wilder areas in national parks. And that's areas where natural processes would be given more priority, more of a say. We start to reintroduce more species. We work with landowners, we work with farmers, we work with national park authorities to do that. And potentially that could even be done on public land, land owned by, Forestry Commission or the MOD or others who own quite a lot of land in national parks. And I think that concept of of wild and national parks also links to the last point I just wanted to make, which taking my Rewilding Britain hat off and putting my Right to Roam hat on, this is what Nick was referring to earlier, because the 1949 National Parks Act was also the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. And obviously 70 years on from that, we have, as Nick referred to, had some extension to our right to roam because of previous Labour governments, so the Countryside Rights Away Act in the year 2000. That only covers 8% of our land surface. However, in England, it covers land that is tends to be remote and far from where most people live. And so, bringing that crow to our doorstep, as Nick referred to it, is something that I'm really passionate about doing. Unfortunately, at the moment, however, the government seems to be going in the opposite direction, because it is seeming to, it is planning to criminalise trespass, and particularly trespass with intent to reside, as it defines it. It's just unveiled its finalised proposals for that extremely draconian policy this week, and published its bill. And in fact, it's so keen not to get serious scrutiny of this legislation that it is scheduled the second reading for this new police powers bill to next Monday and Tuesday. So I'm hoping very much that, Kerry, you might be there and able to comment on it and push back on some of its most draconian aspects. But we really need lots of MPs to turn up and to raise the alarm about this. What it could do is certainly, and this is absolutely its intention, is to criminalise the way of life of the traveller community. That's bad enough. It will also have the consequence, intended or unintended, of criminalising protest camps. And we've seen a huge amount of protest needing to be done over the last decade or more, in which involved protest camps such as the anti-fracking movement, XR, HS2 and so on. All of those essentially forms of protest are essentially now being criminalised as a result of this legislation. And lastly, and it is if you read the details of this bill, they're talking about criminalising trespass with intent to reside. If you simply take a vehicle onto some land and reside there, then you're criminalised. That, to me, criminalises anyone who goes wild camping with a bike. It's as simple as that. It is such a far-reaching and draconian bill with a huge impact on the most marginalised people in this country already, but also on a wider section of the population that is just as we're starting to emerge from lockdown and wanting to enjoy the countryside and go out and do wild camping and go and explore national parks and perhaps go on protests again. And this bill is just coming in to crack down and really, clamp down on those liberties and those freedoms. So those, to me, are three big things that are happening this year, and big important things around how we engage with the land and the biodiversity crisis. And I hope how we can start to do more to rewild the country and open up access to it.
Thank you so much, Guy, and thank you to all the panelists for those introductions and those opening statements. If you'd like to ask a question, then please raise your hand with the yellow thing, yellow sort of reaction, if you want to speak it, or if you do just want to message it in the chat or to me privately, then I can ask it on your behalf. I will open the discussion, really, and panelists, feel free to I will aim my question at a specific person, but feel free to comment afterwards as well and come in on the issues that are raised. Mine is, I think, really to Kerry as the sort of political figure here, and who is in this sort of seat of power. Guy quoted in his book Churchill's quote that land is by far the greatest of monopolies, and we saw spoken, I think, in relation to trespass and so on, about how land is sort of often controlled by a minority. But one of the things that isn't often mentioned is sort of the the background monopolies that are often not land-based, but have a huge influence on how land is used, particularly, for example, agrochemical industries like Monsanto, which of course is now owned by Bayer. And they have huge influence on how land is used, and they have a huge amount of political and lobbying power. And one of the things that very rarely happens or has been offered is actually a way in which these can be prevented from having such an influence on the way in which land is used, and the damage they cause to biodiversity. Monsanto spent 14.5 million euros on lobbying the EU to re-grant it a glyphosate license in 2016. So I wondered, how can we really stand up to the power of these industries, because they do have so much influence on the way in which our ecosystem is sort of controlled.
Wow, that's quite a big question. I think, and again, I think with Guy's book, in terms of who actually owns the land in England, there's some sort of fascinating stuff in there. And I think it's partly, as I said, with the agriculture bill, it helps to an extent because you've got quite a lot of people that just buy up estates in England and didn't have to do very much at all with them to actually get some money in. And I'm hoping that this means a shift. Like I said, you don't just get rewarded for how much land you own. I think there needs to be more pressure put on people to actually make use of their land rather than just sort of land banking. And there's a sort of host of sort of different measures that you could look at to try to bring that land into proper use. But in terms of the damaging thing, I mean, I think this is where the problem is. We don't have proper environmental regulation in this country, and that the Environment Agency is massively under-resourced, and as a result of that, it's very limited in the actions it can take. The Office of Environmental Protection is being established under the Environment Bill to replace the EU regulation. So I think something like 2/3 of our laws on the environment stemmed from the EU, and in theory, it could really mean, that there's sort of greater accountability and, just in terms of farmers releasing effluents or whatever, slurry into rivers, polluting the rivers, that sort of thing. It's quite rare to see prosecutions at the moment. It's quite rare for chemical companies to be held to account. And I would love, between the Environment Agency and the Office of Environmental Protection to see much greater powers. But as I said, I fear that the trajectory is slightly away from that in terms of, I remember having a discussion with some sort of the more sort of traditional end of the farming interests about the whole principle of polluter pays. And what was most strange is they didn't even seem to realise that existed as a concept. And it's quite easy for people to pass the buck because, like, if you're talking about polluting the catchment area of, once pollution gets into the water, it can be sometimes quite difficult to hold a particular landowner to account. But no, that's what I'm kind of pinning my hope on is that we do get that sort of regulatory regime in where we can do that. And you mentioned Monsanto. There is a whole debate brewing soon about gene editing and GM. And again, I think the government's quite keen to move in that direction. And I think it'd be good to have a real debate about to what extent we'd want to support something like that.
Do any of the other speakers want to come in on that, or Chris?
Yeah, I mean, just off the back of what Kerry was saying, I hesitate to sort of put myself in the position of speaking for farmers, but certainly since I sort of became a farmer rather than, I don't come from a traditional farming background, but since I started, actually trying to, living on a farm and producing stuff, I've become a little bit more sympathetic to the dilemmas that farmers face, and I think we sort of ask a lot of them in the sense that we expect them to be successful, independent business people, and we expect them to produce extremely cheap food and also to be good stewards of the countryside. And basically, it's really difficult to do all of those things well. And that's partly, I think, why I want to think in terms of communities taking, I mean, you know, which is not to say that with, you know, with slurry spills and so on, you know, that they shouldn't be penalised. I mean, it's a really difficult one, because on the one hand, from a sort of biodiversity point of view, we want the land to be as, you know, to be as little nitrified and, you know, as few phosphates as possible. And yet on the other hand, farmers, you know, we're encouraging production and sort of encouraging them to sort of chuck all the nitrates and phosphates they possibly can on the land to, you know, to produce cheap food. And I think the way, I mean, obviously there's a kind of regulatory frameworks we need to look at around that, but ultimately it's about communities. I mean, maybe it comes back to Nick and Guy's points as well about the commons, you know, which is partly about communities taking responsibility for how they want their locales to be. And obviously part of that has to be producing food. You know, we have to take responsibility, you know, whether individually ourselves, but within our communities for, you know, who is producing our food, and you know, how we're looking after the landscape there. So I think, you know, there are these sort of real dilemmas of you know, the economic pricing of different inputs and, you know, what we want from our land, which is, you know, we sort of want cheap food, but we also want high nature value. And, you know, and I think we, you know, we as communities, we need to really grasp the nettle of some of the trade-offs that exist there.
Thanks, Chris. Rob, you have a question.
Hi, yes, hi everyone. Good evening, and thanks for organising this event with a great panel. I'm Rob. Bit of a plug. I do some organising around this for Labour for a Green New Deal, and we're working on our ideas in this area at the moment in advance of a potential conference motion later in the year. So please keep your eyes peeled in that respect. And I've certainly got a few opinions of my own, but I'll defer to the expertise of the panel on this one and throw out a couple of ideas which I suppose are circulating. And those two ideas, and I'd like to just open it up to the views of the panel really in terms of, are there lessons to be learned from Scotland in terms of the land reform approach there and encouraging community land trusts and community buyouts? And the other approach, you know, do we need to be talking about nationalisation? I mean, there's an article in the Financial Times about nationalising London's Greenbelt. Can we not get this back on the agenda? Because the land ownership problems are so structural and so significant that they require responses which mirror what Guy has put in the Land for the Many report and possibly go further. Because the land ownership question underlies so many of the structural inequalities in this country. And the massive privatisation of land over the last few decades is a sort of nefarious underlying current of some of the issues that face not just food and farming, but housing and access to green space for public health as well. So yeah, that's the sort of the two ideas I'll throw out there: nationalisation, community land trusts, or can we have both? Or how do people feel about those big policies, those big hows?
Thanks for that, Chris. Nick, do you want to have a go at answering that first?
Yeah, so I mean, it's huge for us, this idea that right to roam is really the first step over the line of a new relationship between communities and land. The Land Reform Act in Scotland of 2003 brought in right to roam at the very same time as the community right to buy. There's a whole other kind of raft of other suggestions that come with it, you know, land value tax, the idea that sort of communities actually contribute to the value of the land, create the value of the land through the kind of infrastructure that they provide around it. So why don't the communities see any take back on the rise of the value of the land? For us, certainly a right to roam act or an extension of the Crow Act is really a signpost from the government pointing people towards interacting with nature. The huge call I was in, I don't know if the People's Republic of Stokes Croft is in Kerry's constituency, but I've just spent the day in Bristol at a place that is essentially a commons. It is it's owned by someone, but it is an area of land deep in the city of Bristol that is there to provide for the community, whether that's arts, kind of pottery. There's a radio station there. There's you know, schemes. People need actual space for communities to come together, and the idea that a community should be supported in in kind of not just having this community, but maintaining it and having some kind of decision over to how that land is used is crucial. And to be honest, I think, not to speak for Guy, but certainly the discussions we've had are that right to roam is really just a really big signpost towards people becoming more connected and more involved. So yes, I'd love to copy what Scotland have done, because I think it's going very, very well for them. And finally, like, crucial to the Scottish Land Reform Act is the clause that it should be reviewed every 5 years. That to me is essential to the Commons. That there's this sense that there's no use in just leaning on laws or statements that were made in the past and try to fit the context of the present into the strictures that were made before. This is something that needs continuous engagement between the community. And that in itself is a really positive thing, because the more work you put into something, the deeper engage, the greater sense of belonging and kind of ownership you have with it as well. Ownership is only fairly recently defined in as limiting way as it is. People used to hold rights in land rather than own the land, and that encouraged a much more interactive relationship, not just with the land, but with each other as well.
Does any other panelists want to come in on the question by Rob?
Yeah, sure.
Guy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I definitely think we need to have more community buyouts in England and in Wales as well. But I think it would be brilliant if we had a community right to buy of the sort that there is in Scotland. I've noticed Vari's put a comment in the chat box saying it's not, it hasn't fundamentally changed land ownership and land inequality in Scotland, and that's undoubtedly true. I mean, there's only about 500 people who own half the private land in Scotland, so it will take a while to get that changed. But equally, I think England is so much further behind Scotland when it comes to its discussion about land reform, and we need to walk before we can run. And I think it would be brilliant to learn from what's gone on in Scotland over the last 20 years, the national conversation that's been had about land, and some of the changes that have occurred in policy, of which community right to buy is one. And there's been a fantastic example recently of a community buyout for the purposes of rewilding, which is the Langholm Moor community buyout. And I think that would be a fantastic way forward. It's community right to buy is good for rejuvenating rural communities. It's also, and it's good for we obviously do have a kind of attenuated form of community right to bid in England, which has allowed certain communities to take over pubs that had been had gone out of business or not been continued, and see them as community assets as well as businesses. And that's great, but there is so much bigger potential, I think, for Nick and I have been to Hebden Bridge in West Yorkshire, and it's a community that lives downstream from one giant landowner who ultimately sends floodwater into their front rooms every winter because of the grouse moor that he owns, and it's their natural flood defence that if they had control over, they would manage it in a very different way. So allowing things like community right to buy for that, I think, would be a fantastic step forward, and it would be great if Labour were to support that in future. Very quickly on nationalisation, I mean, we talked about this, I think, a lot. The group that put together Land for the Many, we did talk about aspects of it as to how far we were to advocate for nationalising more land. And I mean, I think obviously there's been a huge privatisation of land over the last 40 years. So I think partly it's about stopping the degree of sell-off and the rate of sell-off. But I think to me, land ownership is as much about accountability in the end, and about the bundle of property rights that comes with modern land ownership, as it is about simply who owns it. And that might sound surprising coming from someone who's spent ages writing a book about who owns England, but I do think it's about questioning what ownership means. There's that old sort of expression of like that we belong to the earth and the earth doesn't belong to us, and I think we need to get closer to that if we can in our way of treating property, but also it's about separating out that bundle of property rights. So one of the rights that comes with property currently is the right to exclude other people from the land, and that's why I'm fascinated by right to roam and working with Nick on it, because I think it's about do we inevitably have to say that we can't share the land with other people, and I think and another way in which that sort of traditional approach to property rights is challenged, I think, is also through landowners actually living up to the idea of them being stewards of the land. Because if you're looking after the land for the longer term, you're not just using it for your own personal self-interest for the here and now. So I think actually moving towards a system where that is the aim, perhaps then actually the precise details of who owns that land will become over time less and less important.
Thank you, Guy. I know that there's a lot of questions, so I want to try and get through as many as possible. And I know I sort of said we were going to end at 8, so we have a very short spell of time. Chris, there's sort of quite a quick question here for you. Do most farmers have a true ability to decide what happens on their land? This questioner says, I get a sense that most farms are in debt and that farmers don't own the land itself, but are tenants to landowners. What do you have to say to that one?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe Guy might know better than I do what the relative levels of tenancy or owner occupation are. But I mean, I think I've heard people say that tenant farmers are better farmers because they're more incentivized to farm well. But I think what that actually means in practice is they're incentivized to so. In so many ways in society, we're incentivized to sort of squeeze maximum fiscal value out of an asset in ways that are actually quite destructive of community and destructive of nature. And I think you kind of have to be careful just in relation to the previous question in terms of things like land value tax and nationalisation. We've got to take speculative gains out of land ownership and socialise it, but how we socialise it is very key. But yeah, I think a lot of farmers are very locked into, they're very leveraged. There's a sort of pig farmer down the road from me who's sort of got several thousand breeding sows, got massive input costs, and therefore he has to gain sort of massive output costs. And I think that can lead to all sorts of problems, which are less the case if you've got smaller scale farming. There's a kind of missing middle from farming where you get smallholders with 1 or 2 pigs, you get farmers with thousands who are very tied into quite problematic sort of input output chains, but you don't get sort of middle scale farmers with a couple of 100 pigs who are serving local community needs. And that's where things like community land trusts and a sort of community food agenda locally can be much more supportive of farmers, and also, as Guy was saying, sort of hold them to account in terms of their farm practices and its environmental consequences. So yeah, I don't see farmers aren't really the villains of the, well, sometimes they are, to be honest, but it's like people are locked into these big institutional structures that that is kind of hard for them to see a way out of. So we need to find a sort of political language and a set of policy prescriptions that enables us to do that locally. So community buyouts, community land trusts, all of these ways of socializing land, but yet that give people locally, I think, and as individuals, some autonomy of practice. I think are good ways to go, but it's hard in the face of the sort of existing economic incentives that large scale farmers are operating under.
Thanks for that, Chris. Another question is really to anyone, but I think if Kerry would be up for answering this. UNESCO Declaration on the Responsibilities of the Present Generations Towards Future Generations is an international agreement, potentially part of international customary law, which includes provisions related to the principle common heritage of mankind / humanity. How far is this principle legally enforceable in the UK as a regulation for corporate and government malpractice, and particularly with regard to mining activities, pollution and human rights abuse? And I think that also comes on to an issue around whether ecocide can be something that could be brought into law as well. Over to you, Kerry. Sorry, it's quite a big question.
Okay. I don't know what the state, I don't think a UNESCO declaration would be binding in any way. The thing that immediately springs to mind when I saw that was in Wales, we passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations law, which in theory at least means that it does what it says, that you have to consider the impact of policies that you're passing today on future generations. And there is quite a campaign to try to get something like that into English law as well, which I very much support. And I have met with campaigners talking about a law on ecocide, and although I've got some questions as to how it might actually work in practice, if you're looking at a sort of example of, to what extent would what Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil count as ecocide, for example? So where do you set the parameters? I think it's a really interesting concept, and as I understand it, when it was originally on the table when people were discussing other forms of human rights and sort of issues like genocide and so on, and then it was taken off the table. So I would certainly, I think, it's just a question of, what would be the sort of test case as to, where would you set the limits as to what counted as ecocide? Would something like the Cumbrian coal mine count? I think clearly not, because it's on too small a scale. But at what point do the actions of a government cumulatively amount to ecocide? Once you start adding up, every bit of land that's paved over, every Ralph's Moor that's set on fire, or whatever, just where would it come in? But I think it does go back to, if you look at, for one thing that I'm involved in at the moment, I asked about our transport questions this morning, and it sort of shows up the hypocrisy of the government and not making use of the mechanisms that it's got. So Grant Shapps is being taken to court for not looking at the environmental consequences. There's a huge road building program being planned that would release 270,000 extra tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And the civil servants advised that this needed an environmental impact review, and Grant Shapps overrode them. So now there's a court case to try to make him carry out that environmental impact. And we see that, in terms of the relapse. I know people were asking about developers and the power of developers in the chat. We're seeing a real move towards relaxing planning rules and local controls over planning decisions, so that developers can basically do what they want without being held to account. So I think to an extent we have got the mechanisms, in the same way that Client Earth did a really good job in holding the government to account about air pollution, which has led to action. I think we need to be supporting organisations like Wild Justice, like those organisations that are taking this case against Grant Shapps through the court at the moment. And because, I think there are those mechanisms without having to, the big concepts like what UNESCO is doing and ecocide, I think they're not practical tools that we've got in our armoury at the moment.
Thank you so much for that, Kerry. We will have to wrap it up, sadly, just because, of course, we timed it for 8. There is so much, of course, to discuss on this topic. It's such a vast issue, and even our sort of heading was quite broad. So thank you to everyone, and particularly to our panelists, Kerry, Guy, Chris and Nick, for being here tonight, and particularly also to Adam for helping support put this event together. I would recommend really going to read Land for the Many, and also Chris's book, A Small Farm Future, Guy's Who Owns England, and Nick's The Book of Trespass. They're all great pieces of literature, and I really recommend them to you all. Thank you all again for attending tonight, and I'm sorry that we have to end this discussion now, and have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.